Ferdinand Tönnies, The Nietzsche-Cult, published in 1897. Introduction. Nietzsche's opinions and errors, which this work seeks to criticize, have a personal significance for me. I was infatuated with this author at a time when, outside a small circle, almost no one knew him. When his earliest books were published, I was between 16 and 20 years old. He meant a lot to me, and I thought I understood him, that I felt the same way he did. Guided by him, I approached Schopenhauer's philosophy and Wagner's art with reverence. His sudden renunciation of both remained incomprehensible to me. It seemed to me that he had moved from a deeper view to a shallower one, yet I also read his new books eagerly and derived much inspiration and pleasure from them. I was often amazed at how closely my own thoughts coincided with his, but his views on cultural history soon seemed inadequate to me, even though I realized that the apparent depth of his earlier writings was more a depth of feeling than a depth of insight. I then followed other lines of thought and viewed Nietzsche's latest developments with mistrust and concern from the outset. Although I could not help admiring his now unfolding rhetorical and poetic talents, and although the quote, eternal recurrence, end quote, aroused a kind of jubilation in me as a revelation of my own thoughts. However, in terms of their predominant content, these last writings show the ugly picture of distorted expressions, often the attitude of the drunk, the excitable, the desperate, the decadent. I am not surprised when these things make a strong impression on youthful minds. There is the magic of a powerful spirit in them. And when well-educated people, held back by a plumb line of prudence, allow themselves to be enchanted, they will emerge unscathed and cheerful. Of course, enjoyment is conditioned by one's own experience of thought, by extensive knowledge of books and things, by maturity of taste, enjoyment, and criticism. The fact that Nietzsche is read as a fashionable writer by those who lack these prerequisites, for the sake of his catchphrases, his excesses, his mistakes, this may indeed prompt us to warn against him, those for whom the formation of their thoughts is a matter of deep and calm seriousness, and even more so against his shallow followers. Of course, how few can or want to allow themselves such seriousness and calm in the noise and haze of this great factory that today's world increasingly presents itself as. But if no one can escape this influence, if impatient, eager to learn youth wants to know what this new doctrine of the Superman, of the aristocratic valuation and devaluation, quote, beyond good and evil, of the moral code of the master, end quote, is all about, then my answer shall be, truly it is not much, my friends. You may enjoy Nietzsche's writings, even these last poison-soaked ones, and you may learn a thing or two from them, but only if you are determined to learn more thoroughly about the same subjects from others. Nietzsche has neither thought as deeply and coherently about the problems of humanity and culture as is required, nor is he at the height of understanding such things. It is likely that no single author can now completely satisfy your thirst for general and ultimate truths, nor is that necessary. Indeed, I will tell you, this thirst must not be quenched. Preserve your beautiful thirst, beautiful in quotes. Believe in its necessity and value. Take it with you as a companion into the turmoil of life. And when you suffer, remember that many suffer with you, many have suffered before you. Today we need ever new understanding, ever new enlightenment, ever new deepening. We need a philosophical community that devotes itself as its life's work to attempts to reach agreement and thus certainty in every respect about the essential principles. Indeed, first of all, about the essential names of things, and thus also about, quote, good and evil. But this requires much more than knowledge. It requires will, character. That is philosophy, my friends, to continue here in Nietzschean tones, the goodwill to knowledge and to more than knowledge. As true as it is that science means our adaptation to the current and most recent experiences of the human race, that goodwill must nevertheless be suspicious of rapid and dazzling generalizations of the wisdom of the day, suspicious of the inclinations of one's own imagination, of infatuation. In these pages I wish to call for caution, prudence and sobriety, and when Nietzsche, as it were the sum of his practical wisdom, places this new tablet above you, quote, become hard, end quote, I counter with an old tablet whose inscription reads, "O man, remember that you are a man." Section 19. In his prose writings, to call them that in contrast to Zarathustra of his final phase, Nietzsche concentrates on the critique of morality, preparing for the, quote, revaluation of all values. This phase, compressed into the few years from 1885 to 1888, inclusive, comprises the books Beyond Good and Evil, the first of which is boldly subtitled Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, On the Genealogy of Morals, a polemic, The Case of Wagner, A Musician's Problem, which is an interlude that the author himself described as a farce. This was added by Tönnies in the angular brackets. Twilight of the Idols, or How to Philosophize with a Hammer. Finally, the first book of that work, which was to be called, quote, The Will to Power, is available. Attempt at a revaluation of all values. The first book of which is titled The Antichrist, an attempt at a critique of Christianity. These writings do not differ significantly in their external form or formlessness from those of the second phase. However, there is a noticeable effort to create more solid connections and a stricter structure to overcome the aphoristic, we would certainly say fragmentary character, but at the same time the writer, increasingly self-admiring, imagines that he has elevated the, quote, aphorism to an art form, demands that it be taken seriously enough, recommends it for an artful interpretation, etc. The inner form and style distinguish these writings very much to their disadvantage from the earlier ones, as was already pointed out on the occasion of Zarathustra. The serenity and calm are gone, a feverish haste and erratic passion increasingly fill the lines. In the first of the books mentioned, he borrows a, quote, final trait from the last great psychologist, Stendhal, for the image of the free-thinking philosopher. To be a good philosopher, one must be dry, clear, without illusion. A banker who has made his fortune has some of the character required to make discoveries in philosophy. That is, to see clearly what is. Nietzsche imagined himself to be such a discoverer. This illusion takes hold of him. His ego comes increasingly to the fore. He flatters himself that he has given humanity the deepest book it possesses with Zarathustra. He believes himself to be the psychologist who interprets and signifies everything, the philosopher of tomorrow who is infinitely superior to his age, the prophet of the Übermensch, the teacher of eternal recurrence. Dry? On the contrary, what makes these writings so appealing to immature readers is their fluidity, their flow, their impetuous eloquence, which delights in strong expressions, violent invectives, and verbose expressions of personal feelings. Clear? The basic ideas come across clearly, yes, but in between, how much obscurity, how many hints, how much secrecy, how much flaunting of masks, how many announcements of deep and deepest things, how much renunciation of being understood, how much of what he himself had otherwise denounced as artistic vanity, artistic mysticism. Instead of a banker who feels secure in his wealth, Nietzsche is becoming more and more like a bankrupt businessman who builds castles in the air and can no longer pay his rent. Section 20. His own favorite expression becomes, quote, decadence. His favorite idea, to explain everything he dislikes with this word. He knows that he himself, quote, as much as Wagner is a child of this age, that is to say, a decadent, end quote. But he has understood this, and the philosopher in him has resisted it. In fact, he resisted in vain. He only sensed the pathological nature of his own feelings, his growing disgust, his contempt, his conceit, even his megalomania in isolated moments. When he thought he was defending himself, he only revealed himself more and more deeply. He understood the problem of decadence, quote, which preoccupied him most deeply, end quote, only in an incomplete, inadequate, one-sided way. He saw some symptoms and described them sharply, but for the most part he is mistaken when he imagines that he was the first to see and describe them. With a single formula, which varies only in its expressions, he believes he can solve the complicated problem, precisely through the criticism of morality as a negation of life, as a sign of decline, of fatigue. We will examine this criticism and find that he understands here as morality exclusively the affirmation of compassion or altruism. He knows very little about the real characteristics of a healthy culture, of a flourishing and mature social life. He knows nothing about the great economic revolution that, as the crystallization of capitalism, as the proletarianization of the people over the last centuries, has increased tenfold in potency throughout the 19th century. He has not understood that the divergence of the male and female minds, as well as their convergence, the masculinization of women, the feminization of men, and by no means the latter alone, is characteristic of a disintegrating social condition. That extreme and conscious egoism, like extreme and conscious altruism, springs from these separations and mixtures, whereby the latter is to the former, in terms of the sphere of their influence, as about 5 to 100. Nietzsche has hardly any knowledge of the manifestations and causes of physical, intellectual, and moral degeneration. When he has thought most deeply about the problem of decadence, the literary traces of this thinking have unfortunately remained quite shallow. They are the traces of his own pity-inspiring decadence. And yet, it is only in these last writings that Nietzsche himself has appeared and has had the success that not only a crowd of Corribans has attached itself to his name. Zarathustra may have had even more influence in this regard, but that he is taken with all seriousness as if his thought constructs had scientific value. Lou Andreas Salome was the first to speak, wrongly, as we shall see, of a, quote, system of Nietzsche's. Since then, the literature has grown considerably. Mr. Alexander Till, or Alexander Tille, calls one book Developmental Ethics from Darwin to Nietzsche. At the moment I am finishing this paper, a full professor of philosophy is beginning to publish treatises on Nietzsche as a thinker. Another has proposed to present him as one of the, quote, classics of philosophy. What is the basis for these assessments? Nietzsche is a highly remarkable, significant phenomenon. He is a witty, dazzling writer, rich in insights and original turns of phrase. He was certainly not an original and thorough thinker in his first two phases, but was he in the last? His teachings have risen meteorically to the rank of a world event, making his name shine as the representative of a principle, a view of life. Is this, from a social science perspective, a normal fact or a pathological one? Does it belong to decadence? We have already made our judgment clear at the beginning of this critique. Now we must devote ourselves to a thorough examination of this peculiar, quote, teaching.